And let's see, there were a few logistical things I wanted to say before we get started. For starters, do make sure you turn in your responses if you haven't done that on turn down your way out. And a reminder that our next quiz is coming up a week from today. So just a heads up about that. Review sheets will follow soon. I'll probably put one up for you on Sakai this afternoon, if not tomorrow. So do remember about that. And also just another reminder that your midterm projects are coming up. They're due in sort of early mid-November, and November is coming up. So do start working on those and don't leave them to the last day. And that, I think without further ado, I will pass the class over to Megan. Hand it over to you.
All right. Nice to meet all of you. My name is Eagen, and as Dr. Jones said, I'm in the last stages of my writing. I'm doing a dissertation on Renaissance music, specifically music of the Counter-Reformation time period. So I'm looking forward to this discussion with all of you. I wanted to start actually by pulling it back to the Reformation, which I understand you just talked about at the beginning of the meeting. Does anyone read German in here? Want to go for a translation?
Let's see. So, peace when possible, but truth in any case.
Yeah. Peace when possible, truth in any case, truth at all times. This is a quote from Martin Luther, and the reason I wanted to start with this quote is because the beginning of, the Reformation movement was a catalyst event that sparked not only a series of changes in the way people thought about doctrine, the way people thought about music for the church, but also a long series of political conflict, which didn't really come to a resolution until the end of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. And in fact, in many places, such as, I'm working on Augsburg, Protestantism continued to not be recognized as an official religion until the 19th century. And so this is a huge event. The Reformation is a huge event. It touches on all aspects of European life, from the social and cultural aspects of that lifestyle, the music, art, but also political ones as well. And so I thought it's important to keep in mind that the Counter-Reformation could not exist, could not have happened without the Reformation. Those two events are really two sides of the same coin, and that's kind of the way I'm presenting the subject to you today. That being said, many of the topics, and I'm going to touch on some of these today, many of the topics that were addressed in the Council of Trent during the Counter-Reformation are the same topics that were addressed in the 1520s and the 1530s by Luther and other proponents of the Reformation. And in many cases, the conclusions are in some ways reflective of each other. And so although this event sparked a lot of conflict and a lot of debate, in truth, the two sides were in many ways quite similar. They're just really, well, let me get to the actual issues, and then you can decide for yourselves what you think. This is just for review. This is something, this is material that you probably just talked about. But these are some of the ways that the Reformation, the movement of the Reformation, impacted on music. For one thing, we see an increased focus on music for the laity. That's people who are not clerics, people who are not practicing, sort of delivering religious discourse or acting as sermonists or priests and so forth. This can include hymns. We see a huge volume of hymns being produced in the middle of the 16th century. Other strophic songs that are sacred songs like German madrigals. There are a lot of sacred Italian and German madrigals that come out of this time and are in many ways sort of situated so they can be performed by a lay group. Also litanies. Have you guys talked about litanies at all? You might have, does anyone know just from other experience what a litany is? Has anybody ever been to, for example, on the Saturday before Easter, a long Vesper service? Okay. A lot of times at these kinds of, it's cool. A lot of times at these services, there will be a performance of a litany, which is sort of a series of invocations and petitions to either God, Christ, Mary, or the saints. Some of the most famous litanies composed really from the end of the medieval era and moving into the Renaissance are focused on those four categories, those four groups of personages. These are pieces that are extremely easy to sing and to play. They're very, very repetitive. A lot of times the litany is just constructed on something like, Holy God, Holy Mary, pray for us. Oh God, hear us. And they just follow this series of very short invocations and petitions. So this is another thing that a congregation could participate in and did. Another thing that we see increasingly as we move through the Renaissance, as we move through the 16th century, is more and more attention attention given to New Testament texts. When we're looking at pieces, you guys talked about the proper and the ordinary of the Mass, right? When we're talking about pieces composed for the proper of the Mass, these are pieces for introits, pieces as responsories, this kind of thing. A lot of those use New Testament texts and Old Testament texts. And what we see is as we move away from the very concentrated composing of mass movements in the early part of the Renaissance and moving into the late Renaissance, more and more people focusing on these proper texts, and more of those proper texts are those ones that have to do with New Testament material. We also see, especially on the side of Protestant composers, an increased focus on God and Christ, an increased focus on the Trinity over the saints. Although something of the opposite happens with the Catholic tradition, we'll talk about that in just a minute. This emphasis on music as oration. Have you guys ever heard the phrase, this musica poetica phrase? This is something that comes, have you guys heard of humanism? Okay, great. Just could anybody, what was humanism all about? Just like a short sentence. It's not possible to say it in a short sentence, right? But it's about this kind of reinterpretation and focus on literature from antiquity, right? And what comes out of that, as we're seeing, and this is really supported by the establishment of the printing press and movable type in the middle of the 15th century, is a huge increase in the number of people who can read. In fact, as in the work that I'm doing on Augsburg in the 16th century, a lot of the documents, for example, if somebody gets in trouble, they did something wrong, the first thing that they're asked in interrogations is, well, can you read? Could you have known better because you had access to, some sort of moral guidance or some sort of, doctrinal guidance or something? And, increasingly people will say, well, we can't, they use it as an excuse. But the fact is, a lot of people were literate at this time period. That produces and also sort of reflects on an interest in texts of antiquity and going back to these texts. And this concept of musica poetica comes directly out of that environment, this idea that the musician isn't just setting texts that somebody else wrote without a concept of what they're about. Instead, the musician understands what those texts are saying. They're fluent in the text. They can read Latin and Hebrew and Greek. Maybe, we can discuss. But the idea is that the musician can now act as a sermonist or an orator. They have the power of interpreting what they're working with. This is very, very different from the way that musicians are talked about and framed in the 15th century. And for example, you guys talked about Josquin, right? Yeah. Josquin was the first composer to be called a genius. He was also one of the first composers to be ascribed this musica poetica identity. And so we see more and more of this praise of the musician who takes attention to the text and knows what it's about and sets the text in a way that's understandable. I passed up on this concept before, but this is very closely related to the idea of priesthood of all believers. This comes out of the Protestant tradition. Luther never said this. He never wrote this. But the idea that the individual, whether they're a trained cleric or whether they're a layperson, has the authority to read text and interpret text, biblical text, on their own, very much comes out of Luther's writings and is closely related to this musica poetica concept, although this doesn't apply to religious music only. Last but not least, you guys probably talked about this increased use of the vernacular. Luther and one of his companions, Johann Walter, composed actually a German mass in the 1520s. And so you see more and more the use of the vernacular in sacred contexts. Any questions up to this point? Yeah?
I want to know what your opinion is about specifically the Reformation, be it, is this a move towards a new religion or a movement away from Catholicism, or is it just being very progressive in the way that we view religion?
That's a great question, and it's a question that people have come back to again and again and again over the course of history. My opinion about the music from really this early stages of the Reformation, the 1520s and the 1530s, is that from what the authors are saying and what the composers are doing, I don't see evidence that they thought of themselves as creating a new religion so much as adding to or reinvestigating an existing faith. This changes a lot, of course, by the time you get to the 1580s, and all of a sudden, Protestantism becomes a word that you see in discourse, and Lutheranism becomes a word that you see in discourse. That's not going on in this time period, though. And even though, for example, Luther and many of his cohort were excommunicated, they continued to think about themselves as Catholic. Here's a really interesting tidbit for you. I'll get more into this in a moment. But do you guys know the text, the Ave Maria? you guys probably listened to Just Stand Setting or so.
Yeah.
This is a text that ends with a huge invocation to Mary, you know, remember me and memento me. And Luther was publicly critical of this text because he believed that it idolized Mary in a way that was inappropriate. But in his prayer book, the text is printed out. So throughout his career, he had this text in his personal prayer book. So
Yeah, so this
yeah,
is
it's
kind
complicated,
of like,
right?
It's kind of like a movement towards Protestantism without it's explicitly saying,
Right,
because
right.
this is very much so in the Protestant sort of
Yeah.
ideal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. The other thing I would stress, though, is although we kind of put the Reformation in the early 16th century, this was by far not the only Reformation movement. Other like, for example, have you guys heard of Eagen-Jones? He was a Czech reformer who was burned at the stake in the 15th century, who, you know, started a Reformation type movement a full generation before this. And of course, other people who came after Luther, like Melanchthon and Calvin, treated the same topics in a very different way. And so we see really very much a fracturing in different types of movements in different directions, many of which are as much an expression of regional cultures and, you know, kind of, yeah, regional identities as they are about different kinds of religion. And so it's a super complicated concept and you can't really extract the doctrine from the space and the time.